In this day and age, one has more often than not heard about veganism and what it means to be vegan. I wrote an essay in 2018, and I wrote it for school. My teacher corrected it. That was full 3 years ago now. That's why I'm doing this video, because in 4 days, on the 6th of May, it will be the 3rd anniversary of this essay that I wrote. I added on to my essay a bit, and I used a few other arguments. The corrections that my English teacher Larry did at the time were helpful for that as well. And I refurbished it so that I can perform it in a YouTube video, so the format fits. In this day and age, one has more often than not heard about veganism and what it means to be vegan. This latest ethical statement of refusing to eat meat or any other animal derivatives is predicated on the assertion that it is immoral to unnecessarily kill and eat an obviously sentient being. There have been vegans in principle and arguments for strict vegetarianism throughout ancient times up until now. Plutarch, one of the most influential classical writers, had philosophized against eating the flesh of an animal nearly 2,000 years ago in his Moralia. At the beginning of the 18th century, Bernard Mandeville, precursor to Adam Smith in political economy, wrote a fable in his famous The Fable of the Bees, in criticism of excuses for eating meat, portraying a lion as being expected of more virtue than a shipwrecked merchant and slave owner, supplicating in front of the lion not to be eaten. Right. Yet a steadily growing movement has been burgeoning only for about the last decades. Predecessors of veganism, like Mandeville, having seemingly been without avail. In his own days, Mandeville puts this to the, in his words, tyranny which custom usurps over us. Yet he is optimistic when it comes to our general psychological incapacity to be without concern, in his words, when facing the pangs of a violent death. I quote, "I confess I think it ought to move a human creature when he reflects upon the cruel care with which they are fattened for destruction. When a large and gentle bullock, after having resisted a 10 times greater force of blows than would have killed his murderer, falls stunned at last, and his armed head is fastened to the ground with cords, as soon as the wide wound is made, and the jugulars are cut asunder, what mortal can without compassion hear the painful bellowings intercepted by his blood, the bitter sighs that speak the sharpness of his anguish, and the deep-sounding groans, with loud anxiety fetched from the bottom of his strong and palpitating heart? Look on the trembling and violent convulsions of his limbs. See, whilst his reeking gore streams from him, his eyes become dim and languid, and behold his strugglings, gasps, and last efforts for life, the certain signs of his approaching fate." The purpose of this video is not to point out nor make excuses for the inconsistencies in the arguments of non-vegans. Nay, it is not to insult the viewer in labeling him a psychopath by maintaining his or her incapacity for empathy and pity in the face of animal suffering, but to lay out the problem which must be faced when one remains indecisive. Furthermore, it is to present the consistent outcome of substantiations for not going vegan, and also to find out what the issue of veganism inexorably becomes. I won't be simply summarizing all the arguments that are given by people for being or not being vegan. There are two main reasons for leading a vegan lifestyle, the ecological and the ethical one. Apart from the assertion in the introduction, the latter emphasizes what is known as speciesism, the idea that, not unlike racism and sexism, we discriminate against members of other species, e.g., by treating cats and dogs differently from pigs and cattle, loving one while murdering the other. Another argument is the rejection of the unnecessary exploitation of animals. Therein included horse riding and zoos and circuses for human entertainment. Right. We exploit cows for milk and honeybees for their honey. So-called ethical vegans also tend to believe that there should be rights for animals, and therefore argue that we violate them in order to exploit and kill them for food, etc. What is almost never failed to be recognized are the horrifying conditions in factory farms. There's an ongoing initiative against them here in Switzerland. In Switzerland, too, animals live their lives in anguish and misery. The question of what kind of life an animal has lived before being slaughtered is thus stirred up, equivocating, in my opinion, the morality of killing at all in such circumstances. The less philosophical and more scientific issue is that of ecology, namely the problems that posed by animal agriculture to human beings. To mention a few: deforestation, to herd cattle and produce fodder, notably, water pollution as a result of a range of waste products, from manure to plastic fishing nets. Of course, also pesticides that we use in cultivating the plants used to feed animals. And air pollution. Methane and carbon dioxide emissions are for a large part to be blamed on the enormous amount of farm animals that we breed and for the land we use in this process, which could instead be used for other crops or left by itself as forest land, able to sequester, quote-unquote, absorb CO2 in this way. Some say 18%, some have higher numbers, based on additional factors, notably. Broadly speaking, the argument is an environmental one, though there is also an ethical dimension connected to an animal's dignity to live in the wild and for there to be a defined border separating civilization from the wilderness in the name of wildlife management, as opposed to keeping animals of any kind in captivity. Counter-arguments in favor of eating meat, etc., are almost exclusively weak or plainly wrong. Examples of fallacies for a moral argument might be an appeal to culture, nature, legality, popularity. Whether or not the person is aware of the fallacious nature of their argument, has good or bad intentions, is really besides the point, for it is invalid. When sincerely going through the argumentations, one is forced to re-examine fundamental principles that one holds. This is often why, when confronted with such difficult inquiry, most people revert to weak arguments in contrast to the matter at hand. The popular ethical philosopher, to take one example, Sam Harris, responds by pointing out his own acrasia, akrasia in Greek meaning weak-willed, saying, quote, that it is difficult to do what you acknowledge is good, which is, needless to say, a weak excuse to the extreme. A very common argument that I hear is that of the deliciousness of animal products, although this excuse has aged badly and is not that viable today. This can be consistent with the reasoning that one's taste buds are more important than ethically coherent values. And more directly than the animal's life, the one on whose captivity and eventual execution your meal will have depended. Otherwise, one is obliged to admit that one simply does not care. Neither of these are desirable deductions, but the latter, the fact that you simply don't care, do you, is sadly true of most people. In Swiss society today, the ease with which it is possible to go vegan revokes all legitimacy of arguments based on the impossibility of such a decision. There is, however, a very small number of people who have an extremely rare condition or are in such grave a circumstance that it would be impossible for them to go vegan even if they wanted to. This minority is so insignificantly small and irrelevant. But if you really want to ponder on these kinds of modern moral grey areas, has it come to mind that you could be vegan for them, since they cannot? A conceivable bad, and indeed evil, excuse would be the mere inconvenience of trying to be vegan, as if your moral compass shouldn't inconvenience your decision-making responsibilities, as if morality were convenient. It never is. The sheer expediency of such a dismissal comprised in that impactful decision, a decision one makes at least 3 times a day, to eat vegan food or non-vegan food as too inconvenient, is again bound to make me suspicious of whether one cares at all. In conclusion, the ethical problem of veganism has a political component. Firstly, because scientists in the current era have proven that we do not need animal products for our physical health. Secondly, we can refute the practicable impossibility of going vegan in Swiss society today. In Buddhist countries in Asia, some people think of veganism as an ancient ideal, Buddhism, Jainism, you name it. But in fact, it is a modern solution to modern problems. Yet most people simply do not care. What do we do now? Aysel Mazard defines this as our political struggle. Because it is human nature to be indifferent, we are in a struggle against human nature. When one is talking about ethical questions, questions of right and wrong, as it is observable, not everyone can make the necessary decision. Everyone has a responsibility to do the right thing, but many people will remain indecisive. If one already knows that the meat, dairy, egg, leather industries are immoral, if one can make that decision, then one has a duty to make that decision. And as vegan activists trying to pass federal laws making animal agriculture illegal, we shall plead and incite for that decision to be made in the future for anyone and everyone in society beforehand.
At the beginning!
No. For example, I quote, "I confess I think it ought to move a human creature when he reflects upon the cruel care with which they are fattened for destruction. When a large and gentle bullock, after having resisted a 10 times greater force of blows than would have killed his murderer, falls stunned at last."
Ja, aber nicht so das Feste wieder Dude mit der weißen Haar.
Ja, aber es ist schon gut.
Und
Ich
jetzt-
mach's jetzt mal. And his armed head is fastened to the ground with cords. As soon as the wide wound is made, and the jugulars are cut asunder, what mortal can without compassion hear the painful bellowings intercepted by his blood, the bitter sighs that speak the sharpness of his anguish, and the deep-sounding groans with loud anxiety fetched from the bottom of his strong and palpitating heart? Look on the trembling and violent convulsions of his limbs. See, whilst his reeking gore streams from him, his eyes become dim and languid, and behold his strugglings, gasps, and last efforts for life, the certain signs of his approaching fate,